Alcoa, Aluminum Company of America, in cooperation with CBS Television, presents See It Now. Now speaking to you from the control room of Studio 41, Edward R. Murrow.
Good evening. Last week they handed out the Pulitzer Prizes. The gold medals went not to a great metropolitan newspaper, but to two weekly papers in North Carolina. This is Tabor City. This is the street where the Ku Klux Klan deliberately flouted law and order with two full-dress parades. Near here, the Grand Dragon operated. A man was killed, a house burned, and perhaps 50 citizens flogged. This is the Tabor City Tribune. Circulation, 1,700. This is editor Horace Carter, age 32, talking about the Klan he fought.
We felt that no group of people had the right to inflict their type justice on any individual, that no one had the right to take a man from his home and beat him up regardless of what he had done. This is just an American way of life. We have freedom from fear.
Highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed. Scores died before red guns as they stood helpless.
In the summer of 1950, anxiety and uncertainty seized America. The Cold War exploded in Korea, fueling fears of atomic annihilation and the end of peace and prosperity. At home, political strife intensified over issues of race, freedom, and equality. After decades of legalized segregation, the federal government finally took up the cause of civil rights, squarely confronting its southern states.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, or religion, or race, or color.
It's another effort on the part of the president to dominate the country by force and to put into effect these uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights.
Locked in a crusade against communism and the Soviet Union, America faced the gap between its principles and practices. How could the nation promote freedom and democracy abroad when many of its own citizens were denied basic rights?
In the last General Assembly of the United Nations, I usually tried to set forth the American understanding of the rights and freedoms of men as outlined in our own Bill of Rights. And almost always the delegates of the USSR and her satellites would ask, "But how about your treatment of the Negroes in your country? How about your fascist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and your lynchings?" When the Russian delegate asked me those questions, I had no answer.
In this wary and divided America, the ranks of the KKK expanded dramatically. Thousands of white Southerners signed up in reaction to a federal government that seemed determined to desegregate the region. In July 1950, a way of life that had stood in the South for as long as anyone could remember was under assault. In cities, towns, and crossroads throughout the wide region, people had to make choices and take stands. In places like Tabor City, North Carolina, population 2,033.
Tobacco market poised for opening day on Tuesday. Yes, on Tuesday, the biggest day of the year in Tabor City begins, a day that makes all other local holidays seem like Monday morning because
Calvin
on that
Bennett, son
day,
of
farmers
Clinton
start
Bennett of
reaping
Tabor
the
City, is
summer
missing in
harvest.
action.
The second meeting of the annual Carolinas Yam Festival Committee was held at the Merchants Association office here Thursday.
At exactly 9:22 last Saturday night, the much-discussed Southern Society of the Ku Klux Klan made an infamous tour through Tabor City with some 30-odd cars and with 3 to 4 occupants in each vehicle. The trek wound around through the colored sections as well as down the main streets of town. Sirens blew and some blank shots were fired. Horace Carter, the Tabor City Tribune.
One morning, I went in to get a haircut from the late Frank Young was the barber, and I went in and got a haircut, and he said, "Horace, you ought to be uptown Saturday night early because there's something you want to write about." And he wouldn't expound on that. He wouldn't give me any explanation other than that. I kept it in mind, though, and that Saturday night, about dark, I heard a siren blow. And about the time I got uptown, a car with a red cross on the hood eased up highway from 701. The guy was going just 4 or 5 miles an hour, just barely creeping along. And he did have a loudspeaker telling people to watch out that this was the resurrection of the Carolinas Ku Klux Klan.
Resurrection of the Carolinas Ku Klux Klan. This is the resurrection of the Carolinas Ku Klux Klan.
When the motorcade came through, we walked right on down to the edge of the street there, and I looked, and they came by, and I looked in there, and there's guys I knew riding in those cars. Had on those white outfits with that pointed hat, but they didn't have any cover over their face, and they had the inside lights on it. They wanted to be seen.
A couple of times I remember the Klan parading through our neighborhood in Conway, and it was always at twilight or in the evening, right after dark. All the black people were standing in yards and on porches, and it seemed so eerie because it was so quiet. And I remember saying, "Who are they and what's that?" And my mother or some of the adults saying, "Be quiet, that's the Klan."
Tabor City was a tobacco town. And I think that's why the Klan came on Saturday night, because generally farmers in that era didn't come to town but once a week, and that's when they could get the biggest audience and they could pass out their applications for membership. I went home after that motorcade, and my wife was there with the children. She had 2 children at that time, and she knew I was worried, and I just looked her straight in the face and I said, "You know, I've got to make a momentous decision between now and next Wednesday when the next paper comes out, because I can't approve of this intimidation of people by an outfit that's organized outside the law." And I told her then, I said, "You know, it may be very unpopular, but I have to do what I think is right and what my conscience tells me to do."
In the community area in which Horace Carter was operating in Carolina, what you were dealing with was a frontier mentality in which you were, in effect, the embodiment of one side, and the other guys were the embodiment of the other. Everything in these towns was played out on the personal level. Everything in these towns was played out on the absolute level that you either won or you lost. And sometimes the winning and losing consisted of living or dying.
I never wrote an anti-Klan editorial that I enjoyed writing. I wrote these editorials because in my mind that was a duty.
In this democratic country, there's no place for an organization of the caliber of the Ku Klux Klan. Any organization that has to work outside the law is unfit for recognition in a country of free men. Sanctioning of their methods of operation is practically as bad as if you rode in their midst. The Klan, despite its Americanism plea, is the personification of fascism and Nazism. It is just such operations that lead to dictatorships through fear and insecurity. The Klan bases its power on fear and hate of one's fellow man, and not through love, understanding, and other principles upon which God would have us live together.
In the week that followed that initial editorial, a number of concerns came to Carter's attention, and he addressed them in his second editorial. He assured blacks that it was safe to stay in Tabor City. He insisted that virtually all local citizens and law enforcement officials opposed the Klan. What he quickly discovered, however, is that there were many Klan sympathizers among the local population.
And amazingly, I had almost no favorable reaction when those first editorials were written. Some of the best friends I had in the world said, "You're going to get in a lot of trouble if you keep on writing this stuff. You hadn't ought to be writing these people. They're trying to make this a better place to live." I couldn't understand that.
I'm writing of your two editorials of July 22nd and August 2nd, 1950, concerning the Ku Klux Klan organization. According to your editorials, the Ku Klux Klan organization was a lawless hoodlums organization. Now, if I've been informed correctly, the Ku Klux Klan has as their law and guide the Holy Bible. I think the Ku Klux Klan is a very good organization with only one exception. They're getting too far behind with their work. P.S. to the editor, now let's see if you have the guts to put this on the front page of your paper as your editorials appear.
When I came here in 1946, this community was known far and wide as Razor City, also known as Border Town because our city limits joined the state line. We had a little area on the highway just south of town. There were a number of murders in those areas, and there were a number of businesses that sold illegal liquor and gamble.
Used to, there'd be fights in town every Saturday night. There'd be people cutting each other up, fighting. It's moonshine, booze is what did it. There's two kinds of liquor. There's dancing liquor and there's fighting liquor. And I used to get hold of fighting liquor and get my tail beat all the time. But, no, not that bad. But.
In that era, sheriffs were very reluctant to serve any warrants or make any arrests if it wasn't in the state where they were elected or appointed. You only had to step across the line before the guy would leave you alone. That membership in the Klan, they were the type of people who had some vision that they could make things a lot better than they were, and they were going to enforce the law themselves. I think it went all the way back to the Civil War. Up until recent years, the Klan was a hero in the South, and every history book you'd ever seen through the first half of the 20th century were all advocating how remarkable the Klan had been in bringing some law to the South when the carpetbaggers were trying to run the country.
The Ku Klux Klan of Reconstruction was one of the most wide-ranging and notorious criminal conspiracies in all of American history. And ultimately, the federal government had to take strong action to suppress it, and this was accomplished in the early 1870s. In 1915, the famous filmmaker D.W. Griffith released the first genuine Hollywood blockbuster, The Birth of a Nation. This film helped fuel the return of the Klan by projecting the myth of a heroic Klan that protected white people across the South. While the Klan of the 1920s, on a number of occasions, engaged in vicious violence against blacks, the Klan quickly saw, because of its anonymity, it's a secret organization, it could regulate communities. And what we see is just a wave of violence against white moral transgressors. So this is a very vicious organization, but in terms of its targets, it's both black and white, something that you would see with later manifestations of the Klan as well.
After World War II, Klansmen continued enforcing their moral code with violence. Yet, Klan leader Dr. Samuel Green was determined to move the organization into the political mainstream. He never wore a mask and appealed to the public with religious rhetoric.
You have been told by some of the enemy press that this was a hate organization. We don't hate the Negro. God made him black, and he made us white. And you will find this laid out in the 11th chapter of Genesis, in which he segregated the races.
Green died in 1949. The movement splintered but continued to grow. New clans sprang up across the South, with each leader vying to consolidate power. The Klan motorcade of July 1950 brought this movement to the streets of Tabor City.
When I wrote the first editorials, Daddy, of course, got the paper. Daddy and Mother got the paper in the mail. And when I went home the first time, he said, "You must have lost your mind or something. You know the Ku Klux Klan did a great job for all of us in the South after the Civil War." I said, "Well, I know that the school teaches that, and that may be true. But insofar as this resurrection of Carolina's Ku Klux Klan, this is not American, and this is not the way you run this country, and I'll keep right on writing everything I can to oppose them."
In the summer of 1950, many residents of Tabor City made the short trip to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, the crown jewel of the border region. Families crowded the beaches and boardwalks, while more adventurous tourists packed the clubs and dance halls. It was like any other summer in the busy resort town, but on a late August evening, that would change. A Klan motorcade targeted Charlie's Place, a nightclub owned by Charlie Fitzgerald, one of the town's wealthiest black men. His club allowed mixed-race dancing, and side rooms provided moonshine and gambling.
Charlie's Place was in full swing one Saturday night. When the Klan came to town, they actually motorcaded around and around his place, and there wasn't any violence at that point, but they made themselves known, and then they left. But Charlie then said to somebody, "They sure better not come back." Well, that word quickly got to the Klan, and they were still in town. And so the Klan motorcade came back to Charlie's Place, got out of the car, and started shooting into the cafe. In the melee, one of the Ku Klux Klansmen fell shot. He's picked up and he's carried to Conway Hospital, and took off his robe and took off his hood, and he had a policeman's uniform on.
As the police officer lay dying on a hospital gurney, Klansmen abducted and viciously beat club owner Charlie Fitzgerald. The incident became a national story. The NAACP's Thurgood Marshall demanded an investigation, and the FBI began monitoring the Carolinas Klan. Local officials arrested 12 men for the shootout, but an all-white grand jury refused to indict any of them. No one benefited more from the swirl of events and publicity than one of the accused, the man leading the Klan, Grand Dragon Thomas L. Hamilton.
Thomas L. Hamilton thought this was the way to get on the minds of people and change the world. He had a desire to do something, and he wanted to be recognized for it, and the Klan made it easy for him to make the headlines.
Thomas Hamilton was a true believer, with more than 2 decades of experience in the Klan business. A successful grocer and Baptist deacon, he embodied the mainstream aspirations of the KKK. With the national spotlight focused on his Klan, the Grand Dragon announced a huge rally and cross-burning in South Carolina, a dozen miles from Carter's home.
Obviously, that's a news item. If you're going to get 5,000 people together in a cornfield, that's a news item in a little country town like we were. I said, well, I'm going to go, but I better not tell them who I am. They might not like me very well. So I got 2 of my printers, and we just kind of emerged into the crowd and hoped nobody would recognize us.
Unmasked and unconcerned over criticism of recent terrorism, South Carolina Klansmen stage a rally in the Horry County Tobaccoland. Weapons are conspicuously displayed as the defiant Ku Klux Klan meets in the wake of reported shootings, whippings, and nocturnal threats by their night riders. The gathering hears Grand Dragon Thomas Hamilton attack just about everything, from the United Nations flag to the YWCA. He states that the newspapers of America are rotten to the core.
If Myrtle Beach revealed the Klan's militant side, this rally showed its political face. Hamilton created a huge public spectacle. He surrounded himself with 200 robed Klansmen, some of them on horseback, and he was backed by a burning cross 2 stories high. He had a Bible in front of him, an American flag at his side, and a loudspeaker carried his voice across the field.
Thomas Hamilton, Grand Dragon of the Carolina Ku Klux Klan, was the only speaker on a highly publicized program advertised to disclose what really happened at Myrtle Beach. Hamilton told an estimated crowd of 8,000 people that the night the policeman was killed, Charlie Fitzgerald dared the Klan to return to his establishment. Hamilton said, "And ladies and gentlemen, we being white Americans could not ignore that dare from a Negro."
After that, they started criticizing everybody, the Jews and the Catholics and the Negroes and the United Nations and just about everything you can think of except the Klan and the Bible.
No United Nations flag will fly over any school in an area where there is a Klan organization, Hamilton said. He charged that the communists are taking over churches and schools, and that the KKK would fight any effort of Congress to give federal aid to education.
The beautiful part for Klansmen was if they could say that people were communists, that blacks are communists, Jews are communists. We're fighting communism here. We're good, patriotic Americans doing what our government wants us to do. So we're part of this big crusade.
They did pass out some literature telling why they were organizing, because they were going to take over the governments by putting people in office. And at the time would come that everybody would know that the Klan was the boss of Carolina. Hamilton made the statement that some of you don't like the Klan and some of you do, but those who don't like the Klan, you better be careful in what you say, because that man at your elbow may be one of us.
Come to myself in the road. I got up and started running, and 2 men caught me and hit me on the head with a stick. They took my slip off and tied my mouth to keep me from hollering. When I fell down, they cussed me and asked if I couldn't stand up. Then they dragged me behind a car. Somebody hit me on the head and about knocked me out. When they let me go, I crawled to the house and lay there until they left.
Evergreen Flowers was a black housewife, and she said that one Saturday night she went to the door and there were some Klansmen in her yard, and the Klan came in and said, "Listen, we came here to punish your husband. He's been running around with a white woman." And she said, "Well, he's not here." And she was scared to death. "He's not here." They said, "Well, in that case, we'll just beat you."
The Flowers beating was one of 3 inflicted by Klansmen on the same night in January 1951. Night riders also flogged 2 white farmers in South Carolina. The Klan targeted all 3 victims as punishment for their alleged immoral behavior. Thomas Hamilton helped plan the attacks, a selective show of force exhibiting his Klan's willingness to uphold its moral code.
A lot of people got the idea that this was just strictly a white male organization that was going after black people. But far more whites were flogged than blacks.
The people here in Columbus County didn't know who would be the next victim, and none of these would be used on him. I myself have seen these victims, and I can certainly see the signs where this instrument of torture had been left on them.
I mean, vigilantes arise over and over again because they think that there's a destruction of an order, of law and order. The Klan really sees itself as the great cleansing agency of white civilization. It is both the defender of it and the cleanser, and it has entitlement because it stands for the highest ideals of the white race and the American white society.
This outburst of Klan violence focused on poor farmers in the countryside. In town, most white residents did not yet feel threatened. But Horace Carter's editorials made him a target.
I had my share of the fear like everybody else. And right in the heart of the Klan campaign, I walked home one afternoon late, and the landlord met me and said, "Horace, what you making pictures of this house for?" I said, "I hadn't made any pictures of the house." He said, "Somebody's been making pictures of this house for the last 2 days." My phone rang. I was outside, and I excused myself and went up, picked up the phone, and the man said, "This is Dr. Morgan in Myrtle Beach." And I overheard a conversation on the telephone that I think you ought to know about. He said there was a Klansman on that line talking to a hitman in Tampa, Florida, and they're going to kill you today. I went in and told my wife about it, and she obviously was scared, and so we took the children to somebody else's house for the night, and she came back and we spent the night there. They didn't kill me, obviously. I've said many times it would have made a much better story if I'd have got killed.
The fear of violence was very real, so he had to decide, is it worth to him to put his family at risk? That's probably his overwhelming and paramount concern.
At the height of the crusade, there was never a day passed that we didn't get threats either on the phone or in the mail or in person, and always it was threatened to capture my children, kidnap my children, or burn my office down or burn my house down.
I would come home from school and Mother would say, "Linda, you're going to go spend the night with Margaret Ann tonight." These were times when there had been a threat on Daddy, but Mother and Daddy would never leave. They would always stay in the house, but they did not want the children there. They had tremendous pressure on them, especially my father, and my mother was always very supportive of whatever he did, and how they continued day-to-day life trying to have everything normal is really kind of remarkable.
I told the sheriff at that time, he was a friend of mine, "I want you to know that I'm a hunter. I've been a hunter all my life. I've got automatic shotguns, and if they try to take me out of my house, some of them are going to be left in the yard full of bullets."
As the threats escalated, Carter attempted to send a message to the man at the head of the Klan.
I told that Barbara that tipped me off on the first motorcade, I would just like to talk to Thomas L. Hamilton sometimes, because I just like to see him answer some of the questions that's on my mind. The next day, Thomas L. Hamilton showed up in my office. Thomas L. Hamilton was a big man physically. He had a round face, wore glasses most of the time, and he was a very tough-looking person. And in the height of this problem, the Grand Dragon came to my office, not hooded, and he was not masked, and he came to me to just tell me what foolish editorials I was writing and that I had better quit.
Thomas Hamilton and Horace Carter shared much in common. Both men were born and raised in small Carolina towns. Both were devout Southern Baptists, and both were ambitious entrepreneurs.
Thomas Hamilton was 14 years older than Horace Carter and much bigger physically. Unlike Carter, Hamilton had lost his father when he was only 7 years old, and he was deeply influenced by his grandfather, a Confederate veteran. Hamilton's education was also very different from Horace Carter's. He studied the grocery business and the Klan after graduating from high school.
Hamilton joined the Klan in 1926 at the age of 19 while working for a grocery in his hometown of Aiken, South Carolina. Moving to nearby Augusta, he opened his own store and soon came under the sway of Dr. Samuel Green. Green mentored the young man and eventually made Hamilton one of his close confidants. All the while, Hamilton and his wife hid their Klan activities from other family members.
Tom was always active, working just as hard as he could work, either on the books and, of course, going to his organizations. He was always going to a luncheon with the Exchange Club or the Masons or church. He is a person that wanted to be in charge. He wanted to do all this stuff, and he did it, and did a good job. He was smart as the mischief.
Hamilton was so close to Greene that many expected him to become Georgia's Grand Dragon when Greene died in the summer of 1949. But Hamilton was passed over, and he was so angry about it that he severed all his ties with the Georgia Klan. He left Augusta and moved to Leesville, South Carolina. There he organized a new group, the Association of Carolina Clans, to cover South and North Carolina. The parades, motorcades, and cross burnings followed. Then came the violence at Charlie's Place, the big rally in Horry County, the floggings, all in the months preceding his visit to Horace Carter's office.
If the Klan and Samuel Greene defined Thomas Hamilton's path in life, journalism, the University of North Carolina, and Frank Porter Graham defined Horace Carter's. In high school, Carter worked at his hometown newspaper, writing a sports column and setting type. He was accepted to the university in 1939.
I remember it like it was yesterday because all the clothes I had one little handbag, and I walked in their office and I just said, I'm Horace Carter from Indy School down in Stanley County, and I want to go to school up here, and I want to know if I can go to school with $112. That's all I got. I made it working in the cotton mill for $10.87 a week. Self-help director and looked me straight in the face and said, I've known people who got through on less. He said, I want you to go with me over to the University News Bureau and you can start tomorrow. And I did. I learned a lot working with that news bureau, and it just enhanced my desire to stay in journalism one way or the other.
He was elected editor of the student newspaper, the Tar Heel, which gave him the opportunity to interact with the progressive president of the university, Dr. Frank Porter Graham, who would become one of his personal heroes. Graham led the UNC system during the 1930s and 1940s, and in the process became nationally known as a defender of academic freedom and one of the leading Southern liberals of his day.
When I got to be the editor of the Tar Heel, every Sunday night I went to Dr. Graham's house and we talked about campus problems and the things that the newspaper ought to be writing about. I'd heard both Mother and Daddy saying at one time or another growing up to not mix with the blacks, and Daddy had died before he'd sit down and eat with one. I had maybe some of that prejudice till I was 18 or 19 years old, but I never had any prejudice against blacks after I met Dr. Frank Porter Graham. And I think that he made me much more aware of the need for racial equality and that the courts weren't always fair to people of all races.
Carter served in World War II before graduating from university. He used all his savings to move his family to Tabor City and start the Tribune. Now he stared across his desk at the biggest story of his career.
Thomas L. Hamilton said, I'm here if you ask me anything you want to ask me. And I asked him why he was organizing a Ku Klux Klan in the Carolinas. And he said, because the federal government just got completely out of control and they're gonna send black and white children all to the same school. And he says there's just a variety of things going on in this country that somebody's got to oppose. And I think the Klan is the way to start it. And as time goes on, we will control politics in these Carolinas, and other clans will control politics elsewhere. And that is the reason for our being here. I had some fear. I said, he may be just looking around so he can see how he's going to get some men in here and tear up my machinery one of these nights. And that's when he really, really impressed me with the fact he was going to get his people to boycott our retail advertisers. He said, you can't exist, as we'll have every one of our members to stop reading your paper and tell all of them not to do any business with any store that advertises in your paper. That would have been a death blow to me at that time. That would have been the end of the Tabor City Tribune.
Of all our races in the United States, what race should be the most dissatisfied? What race has been purposely held back for generations? Is there a man alive who believes the Negro anywhere in this country has equal opportunity? Have you in Tabor City taken a look at the local colored school any time in recent years? You must also know that wages a Negro earns in this country, in most instances, are smaller than those earned by a white man doing the identical job. The Negro has never had equal opportunity.
Despite Hamilton's proposed boycott and a steady stream of anonymous threats, Carter kept reporting on Klan activities, and he pushed even harder in his editorials. He broke with his community and began speaking against the South's pervasive racial discrimination and inequality.
Take, for example, his editorial, Right is Right and Vice Versa. In it, he challenged the local white community's response to a public incident involving a local black teacher who was apparently slapped without provocation by a white man who'd reportedly been drinking.
Now, you think about it. Suppose the situation had been reversed. Suppose the Negro man had slapped a white woman after making the same advances. What would have been the reaction in Tabor City? And what might have been the possible legal consequences? There's little doubt that it would have been made into a big thing fast, and the assaulting party might well have served a long road or prison sentence, possibly even something more radical. Yet not much is said or done about it legally or otherwise when the situation did occur in reverse. Is it right? Is it Christian? Is it democratic, the way we see things in the light in which we want to see them? Is it so much worse one way than the other? In the eyes of God, there is no difference in the offense. And as we see it, there's still right and there's still wrong.
Meanwhile, Hamilton's Klan seemed unstoppable. He led another motorcade through Tabor City. In June, the town's leading Klansman, a businessman who participated in the Evergreen Flowers assault, won election to the Board of Commissioners. Then on August 15th, in a dusty cornfield just north of Tabor City, Hamilton staged the first Klan rally in North Carolina since the 1920s. With thousands in attendance, he delivered an angry counterpoint to Carter's editorials.
Do you want some burr-headed Negro to come up on your porch and ask for the hand of your daughter in marriage? Look at the University of North Carolina, where blacks now attend with whites. If I had a daughter in that place, I would never let her darken its doors again. If you have a boy or a girl at the University of North Carolina, then take him or her out. Negroes will never enter a white school as long as the Klan exists. I don't care what the Supreme Court does about it. Blood will flow in the streets before that happens.
It bothered me somewhat to think that he might get an overwhelming majority of these people on his side, because we couldn't fight a situation in where half the people in our town were Klansmen. We couldn't do that.
Carter covered the rally. So did Willard Cole, editor of the News Reporter of Whiteville, North Carolina. After the event, Cole ramped up his coverage of the Klan and his editorials condemning the group. The KKK reacted with threats against both men. Cole and Carter were casual friends, but now formed a strong alliance.
I often talked with Willard about the Klan and what they were going to do next and what we were going to say next. He never tried to tell me what to say, and neither did I tell him what to say, but we both felt the very same way about it. He had a lot of threats against his life and his home and his children.
As Hamilton stepped down to flashing cameras and the applause of thousands, his ambitions seemed within reach. He envisioned himself the leader of a national movement. After the rally, Klan applications poured in. With an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 members, he was building a small army. Some of his Klansmen now held public office, and he was compiling a slate of candidates for the next political season. One of the men Hamilton put in charge was Early Brooks, whom the Grand Dragon promised to support for sheriff. Brooks had more than a decade of experience in law enforcement, and during that time killed a man under controversial circumstances.
Early Brooks, he was a former police chief. It seemed that there was a tendency on the part of people near law enforcement to be members of the Ku Klux Klan.
Early Brooks seemed to be the ideal lieutenant, an aggressive man who could do the Klan's dirty work while the Grand Dragon kept clean as the public face of the KKK. But Hamilton badly miscalculated. Where he used violence selectively, Early Brooks and a cadre of men were about to unleash the Klan.
Thomas Hamilton had chartered a Klan in North Carolina, and I, Early Brooks, was voted in as the exalted Cyclops. The Granger-Martin situation was the first business on the agenda. Ben Granger and Dorothy Martin were not only cohabitating together, but Granger was reported to be making and selling moonshine whiskey. It was alleged Dorothy had recently returned from the hospital following an abortion. According to the traditional plans, it was appropriate to hold prayer before a victim was lashed, as well as to allow the victim to say a prayer for himself. When one of the Klansmen asked Ben if he wished to pray, he stated that he did not know how. 5 or 6 blows were laced to his tail. The strap was then used on Dorothy's legs.
In October of 1951, Early Brooks and his Klan flogged Ben Granger and Dorothy Martin without Thomas Hamilton's approval. The attack marked a turning point. In their zeal to deliver righteous punishment, the Klansmen grew reckless. Brooks and his men kidnapped the couple in North Carolina and carried them across the state line. That violated federal laws and got the attention of the FBI.
The FBI agents that J. Edgar Hoover sent down here, they infiltrated the Klan membership in this Tabor City area. 2 or 3 of them came into my office from time to time, and we talked about the Klan. They did comment that they were glad to see my editorials against the Klan because they liked to have the people with them when they could.
Widely known for investigating communism and apprehending high-profile bank robbers, the FBI made this investigation one of the Bureau's first attempts to build a federal civil rights case against the Klan. At the same time, Thomas Hamilton struggled to control the organization he had built, as Early Brooks and other rogue Klansmen launched what locals called the Reign of Terror, a drumbeat of weekly abductions and beatings throughout the countryside.
Masked, night-riding mobsters enticed a Columbus County resident from his home and then severely beat him about 10 miles from Tabor City. October 10, 1951. Men wearing white robes tied George Kemper Smith's hands around the trunk of a tree. November 1951. Esther Lee Floyd, Chadburn area Negro woman, taken from home at gunpoint, mob-cut cross in her hair. December 1, 1951. Lee Tyson, a 50-year-old tenant farmer, and his wife Louise told a graphic story of how they were seized. November 18, 1951. Dorsey Robinson, a Negro of the Chadburn area, was whipped and flogged. January 1, 1952. Lawyer Jernigan was flogged by a mob and told that his 25 licks were just a sample.
It was something during that time that we can't describe in words. It was something that had to be felt. If you lived in this section, you would feel it. It was something that was written on the faces of persons as you passed them day by day. You didn't have to ask them, have you heard? You knew they had heard, but it happened by the expression on their faces, and they knew you had heard. It was simply a matter of wondering what next, who next, and when will it all end.
After a year and a half of constant Klan activity and building tensions, the Klan maybe became overconfident and took on an institution that was at the central core of Southerners, certainly in that area and throughout the South at the time.
In the fall of 1951, a local Methodist church invited a black gospel quartet to perform at an evening service. Early Brooks was a member of the congregation.
When Brooks found out about it, he went to the church first and then to that quartet and told them, don't you show up over there. If you show up, there's going to be all kinds of trouble. And they didn't show up. We think that was one of the really bad cases of fear taking away justice, and it shouldn't ever happen that way, and there were a lot of people very ashamed that it ever did happen like that.
On the evening of the canceled concert, as cars of Klansmen circled the church, nervous members of the congregation stood guard with guns in their pockets. The episode shocked the community and caused a number of angry citizens to begin cooperating with the FBI.
It was into this tense atmosphere that the FBI came to investigate the floggings of Ben Granger and Dorothy Martin. Some of the local inhabitants were sympathetic with or friends of the Klan members. Although Early Brooks and some of his associates worked hard to persuade Klansmen not to talk to FBI agents, persons were located who possessed information, and several participants to the floggings confessed.
And still, despite the growing scrutiny, Klansmen continued their reign of terror through the end of the year and into early 1952.
The Klan worked itself up into a frenzy, and it spread throughout the whole community, this terror, and it was growing. And the violence was extending to many people in the area. This was a tipping point. This was the pivot point where the Klan had gone too far.
All this needless fear is an outgrowth of the KKK and an evil thereof. From the start of this organization in our area, we believed they were largely a bunch of disgruntled persons and low-type individuals. There are other reliable reports that the FBI is nearing the day when arrests are going to be made and KKK members exposed. This is our greatest hope. If arrests are not made, it can only end one way. That is mass tragedy with several persons meeting their death.
As his Klan ran wild, Thomas Hamilton fired off an angry letter to Horace Carter. A furious exchange followed in the pages of the Tabor City Tribune, a public debate for the hearts and minds of the community.
Dear sir, I read you express your opinions in your paper, or should I say trash sheet. One thing that the organization of which I am leader stands for is freedom of the press. Freedom of the press when used recklessly by some individual whose mind is warped.
Mr. Hamilton, in one respect we see eye to eye. We believe in freedom of the press, and for that reason your letter is printed in this trash sheet. You charge that my mind is warped. Perhaps you will accept my challenge to appear with me before any qualified psychiatrist. Might be interesting to see just whose mind is warped.
You state that the Klan is against the constitutional principles laid down by our forefathers. Your leanings and warped ideas could not give a fair interpretation of the Constitution.
Have you ever really read that document? A man who so roundly criticizes the law, the Negro, the Jews, the Catholics in public speeches everywhere, and who still professes to believe in the principles of our democratic government is stretching an interpretation much further than I can imagine.
My sole ambition is in some way to help lift a sinful and perverted nation back on its feet and into its rightful place. God has a mission for each individual, and he should shoulder the responsibility that God has given him.
Back to God and country, to which I can say only amen. But as to missions given by God, I can't help but wonder if God gave you your mission or if he gave me mine, or if he'd rather you cease your operation or me mine.
When sufficient evidence had been obtained, the investigating agents left for several days, and the Klansmen rejoiced in the mistaken belief that the FBI had abandoned the case. The next the community saw of the FBI was at 7 a.m. on February 16, 1952.
FBI today arrested 10 former klansmen in North Carolina on charges of kidnapping and flogging kidnappers at a Ku Klux Klan parade last October. He said the arrest followed an investigation after reports were received about flogging and other instructions as well. FBI Chief J. Cooper said that the arrest was aimed.
The FBI launched a surprise attack on the Klan. Some 30 FBI agents, assisted by state and local lawmen, arrested Early Brooks and 9 other Klansmen for the kidnapping of Ben Granger and Dorothy Martin. The action was unprecedented for the FBI, marking the agency's first major crackdown on the Klan. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover announced the arrests in Washington.
After a year or two of these floggings, J. Edgar Hoover called in some of his FBI agents and said, "You go down there to Tabor City and don't you come back till you put them in jail." That was a big day in my memory because I didn't know whether they were going to ever convict anybody or ever indict anybody. My wife was happy, but as I thought it then, and she said then, you know, that doesn't eliminate all the fear that we ought to still feel because there's still some of those Klansmen out there. They may blame you for these other friends getting arrested, so we may be in just as much danger as we ever were.
Thank God there is still law, courts, and justice in Columbus County. Our biggest hope is that those individuals who have taken part in the other floggings also feel the strong arm of the law reaching out for them wherever they are. We want to see each of them ferreted out from behind this mask of cowardice to face the world and pay for the crimes he has committed against his neighbors.
The unmasking of the Klan continued throughout the spring and summer of 1952. By July, 2 years after Carter witnessed the Klan motorcade in Tabor City, some 80 men had been indicted on more than 200 charges related to the floggings. Early Brooks was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in several of the attacks. Thomas Hamilton pled guilty to plotting the assault on Evergreen Flowers and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Shortly before he was paroled, Hamilton released a letter repudiating the Klan and its violent tactics. He never rekindled his KKK affiliation, yet, like many of his generation, he long remained an advocate for segregation.
Hamilton was a kind of a docile man after he was convicted in court. I only saw him once after that, and I believe that was the day that he was released from prison, having served 2 years out of his 4 years. And as far as I know, he went back to Leesville, and I have never seen or heard anything about Thomas L. Hamilton since that day.
Last week, they handed out the Pulitzer Prizes. The gold medals went not to a great metropolitan newspaper, but to 2 weekly papers in North Carolina. One has a circulation of 1,700, the other has a circulation of 5,000. Their editors decided to fight and expose the Ku Klux Klan. They were told that they would lose circulation and advertisers. They lost neither.
It is a great pleasure to present to you Horace Carter, editor of Tabor City Tribune. Back in 1950, when our little paper started fighting the Ku Klux Klan, we certainly didn't do it with any idea of winning any national awards. We only did what any reputable newspaper would have done had it been located in our position. We fought the Ku Klux Klan because we didn't feel that any person or group of persons had the right to inflict their own type of justice on the people. Naturally, I'm very much pleased with the Pulitzer Award. It's one of those things that you only dream about. I'm very grateful. I only hope that we did half enough to deserve it. Thank you very much.
The months following the Pulitzer Prize were a whirlwind for Carter. He went on a national speaking tour, appeared in Look magazine as one of the nation's 10 outstanding young men, and was honored by the U.S. Congress. But when it was over, he returned to Tabor City, to the Weekly Tribune with its circulation of 1,700. His name remained as editor and publisher for the rest of his life.
It's easy today to look back at this period and to wonder why, if in fact they were good, decent Christian people, more white Southerners didn't speak out against the Klan and speak out about the terrible things that were being done to black people in particular. But if you imagined being a white person back at that time, would you have been willing to take the risk? Not just that you're going to be facing Klan violence, but remember the great, great social sanctions that could be levied against people at that time if they were seen as going against the racial status quo. And I think that's what makes the resistance and honesty and the effort made by people like Horace Carter just so incredibly admirable in retrospect. They did the right thing and were willing to bear the price.
We suggest that if the fight against intolerance, bigotry, race prejudice, hatred, and fear is to be won in this country, it must be won in the towns such as those two that you have seen here, in the white villas in the Tabor cities throughout the land.